All right. Well, good morning. I'm Rob Dickinson. I'm with Community Rights Lane County and the Yes on Measure 20-373 campaign, and I'll be facilitating our discussion today. Well, welcome. It's really great to see all of you here. It's great to have a packed room. Thanks for being here. Our program today is called A Watershed Moment, Clean Water, Rights of Nature, and Watershed Protection on the Ballot in Lane County. Today, we'll be talking about a groundbreaking, rights-based citizen initiative here in Lane County that is aimed at protecting our local watersheds and affirming our right to clean, safe water. With ballots going out in about 6 weeks and the election just 2 months away, the election day just 2 months away, this is a really timely moment to be talking about this measure. Along the way, we'll also take a broader look at the growing global movement around the rights of nature, and we'll explore the economic and community impacts of resource extraction in our watersheds. We hope this discussion helps show why this vote it could be a landmark moment for Lane County, for Oregon, and perhaps even broader for communities around the country. We'll begin by hearing from each of our three panelists, and then we've reserved about a third of our time for questions and discussion. We're very fortunate to have a thoughtful and knowledgeable panel of experts with us today, and I'd like to introduce them. Dr. Craig Kauffman, he's an associate professor of political science at the University of Oregon, where he specializes in environmental politics, international relations, and ecological law. His research focuses on the rights of nature, sustainable development, and transnational advocacy networks, with particular attention to watershed governance in Latin America. He's also the founder and executive director of the Jurisprudence Monitor, an interactive map showing all of the ecological laws around the planet. We also have Ernie Niemi, who is a scientist and natural resource economist. He's trained at the University of Oregon and Harvard. He's president of the Natural Resource Economics, where he specializes in economic impact analysis and understanding the economic importance of natural resources. We especially appreciate the way that his work helps us connect what is happening in our watersheds to the everyday well-being and quality of life of residents of Lane County. My colleague Michelle Holman is a chief petitioner for Measure 20-373 and the Lane County Watersheds Bill of Rights, and she's also a founding member of Community Rights Lane County. Michelle grew up in Southern Oregon, graduated from the University of Oregon, and has lived for over 40 years in Oregon's Coast Range, where she has seen firsthand the human impacts of industrial forestry. She's served on the Mapleton School Board for over 35 years and is a lifelong activist for social and environmental justice. We're glad to have our panelists, and we're really glad that you're all here, and let's get started. So we're going to start off with Dr. Craig Kauffman and talking about the rights of nature.
Great, thank you. So that was a great introduction, so I'll just get right to it. So again, just to give you some my background context, again, one of my main projects is I run the Jurisprudence Monitor, which tracks initiatives around the world to embed ecological jurisprudence into various kinds of legal initiatives. Rights of nature is just one of many different kinds of ways that you can sort of structure these underlying principles, both sort of culturally and legally and so forth. So just to give you but rights of nature is one of the most prominent examples. So just to give you a sense of the size of the movement globally, I mean, there are almost 700 of these initiatives across 62 countries. And so here, today we're talking about rights for river systems, watersheds. So just to give you some aggregate numbers there are 140 rights of rivers legal initiatives across 25 countries on all 6 continents, right? And many of these, the vast majority of the ones that have been put to a decision-making body have been adopted. So roughly, 91, I guess, or 96, of the 96 that have gotten to the point where they've been submitted to a formal decision-making authority, and a decision's been made, 3/4 of them, 75, have been adopted and only roughly a quarter have been rejected. And there, as a signal of the size of the movement, 44 initiatives have been drafted and submitted and then are awaiting a decision. 39 of these are in the United States. So again, so if you're looking at rights of nature initiatives, local rights of nature initiatives, there are actually many more than these. There's about 160 some scattered around the country, but many of them address nature in the abstract. So 39 of them are specifically addressing rights of rivers. So what I wanted to talk to you today about is the need to create concrete regulatory frameworks to enforce these. So it's one thing to get them adopted, but it's, implementation is where the rubber meets the road, right? And one of the main critiques that's being levied against this movement is that it's too abstract. It's not clear how you would recognize when a rights of nature violation occurs, and then how you would measure performance on this. In essence, like, how do you create a regulatory framework that can be used to allow policymakers to enforce this systematically? So Ecuador has led the way on this, and I should say this has been the topic that scholars have really focused on for the last 5 or 6 years, because we've now gotten to the point where we're sort of moving past these moral philosophical questions to where policymakers are having to grapple with this. And so in my limited time today, I'm going to describe to you the regulatory framework for rights of rivers that's being developed in Ecuador, just because they've advanced the furthest in this so far. And in part that's because, as many of you know, I'm sure, Ecuador was the first country to recognize rights of nature generally in its constitution. As just sort of a background, a lot of this regulatory framework has been developed by the courts. I don't have time to sort of go into the politics of why that is, but suffice it to say, for political reasons, the executive branch, which would normally be responsible for constructing this regulatory framework, didn't address this. And so because it's in the Constitution, there are all these court cases percolating through, alleging violations. And finally, around 2019, the Constitutional Court said, all right, we were going to select a series of cases to create binding jurisprudence that settles a lot of these, about how you interpret rights of nature as it intersects with a variety of different constitutional rights, like economic rights, human rights, cultural rights, and that sort of thing. And so this is where essentially the process for how they came about. This is why you're getting this jurisprudence and this regulatory framework through the courts, essentially. And in some ways, this was actually a good thing, because the judges in the court went and consulted heavily with scientists and also indigenous peoples with traditional ecological knowledge. And so the regulatory framework is being rooted in science as opposed to political considerations, as would often normally happen if this was done through the regulatory administrative channels. So just as background then, for those of you who are not familiar, there are 3 articles in Ecuador's constitution that recognize rights of nature. And the way it's structured is specifically nature has a right to its integral respect for its existence and for the maintenance and regeneration of its life cycles, structure, functions, and evolutionary processes. And I point this out because it's not, so it's important that these scientific principles of ecosystems as systems having life cycles with particular structures and functions and evolutionary processes that's embedded into these rights, right? Because this then creates an opening to say, how can we use traditional ecological knowledge as well as ecological science to see when ecosystem's ability to regenerate its life cycle is threatened or not. And so I'm going to essentially lay out the framework that was created through 14 court rulings by the Constitutional Court and then also lower courts addressing rights of river systems. One of the underlying principles for all this, which is really important, is that as early as 2015, the Constitutional Court ruled that rights of nature is transversal, meaning that it affects all the other rights in the Constitution. And the logic that they gave for this is that In the Constitution, it draws on a traditional Andean indigenous concept of sumak kausa. I don't have time to really go into that, but the important aspect of that is that it recognizes nature as a system in which all the component parts are interconnected through reciprocal relationships. So nature is conceptualized as nested ecosystems of interdependent biotic and abiotic elements, and that includes humans. So we're part of nature, and that means this is very different from the way law in the Western world often conceptualizes nature. Very different from conceptualizing nature as independent stocks of resources that you can just sort of pull apart, manipulate, reorder, so forth and so on. By recognizing the systems and relational approach, then you're recognizing that rights of nature, human environmental rights, and indigenous cultural rights are all interrelated. And so protecting river rights is also a way to protect the rights of communities that depend on that river, including indigenous cultural rights. So in the Constitution, the rights of nature are fairly abstract, but the court ruled that you can infer from that that specific ecosystems have rights because, again, nature is conceptualized as nested systems in which local ecosystems are nested in broader systems and so forth and so on. And then since all ecosystems are unique, the standards for measuring the violations of those systems have to be tailored to each ecosystem type, right? So river rights are going to probably look different from ocean rights, which might look different from forest ecosystems and other kinds of wetlands, for example. They all have different types of life cycles. Right? So the court then started turning to different types of ecosystems to establish binding jurisprudence, and because the vast majority of issues surrounding rights of nature in Ecuador around rights of rivers, not coincidentally because fresh water is one of the main ways that humans sort of interact with or experience the pressures of climate change and biodiversity loss, rivers are particularly important. So one of the first principles, the first case that the court selected to go down this road of creating binding jurisprudence was in 2021. And that particular case was chosen for the purposes of settling issues or questions about how rights of nature should be interpreted and enforced in fragile, endangered ecosystems generally. And so the case they chose was Los Cedros, which was a protected forest. So it's not a river case, but it established this underlying principle that then has huge implications for how you conceptualize river rights. And this is the idea that, the principle that of ecological tolerance. So this idea that natural systems and the organisms within them have specific limits for environmental factors, so temperature, moisture, nutrients, etc., beyond which they cannot sustain their physiological processes or natural cycles. So if you're trying to think about where do we find the threshold for when an ecosystem's ability to have its right to regenerate its natural cycles, you have to have a sense of what its tolerance levels are, for example. Incidentally, in terms of policy, I'll just note that one of the implications of this ruling is that it leads to the precautionary principle, right? This idea that if there's a risk of irreversible damage and there's scientific uncertainty, the state must implement protective measures favoring nature. And then that then has shifted the burden of proof to the polluters. That is to say, state and private entities must demonstrate that a proposed activity will not violate river rights. And what this means in practice is that the courts establish that it's not enough to have procedural compliance. That is to just say, you can't just say, I got a permit from the Ministry of Environment and therefore you can't say that I didn't violate the river's rights. No, the river's rights can be violated despite the fact that you did an environmental impact assessment and you got a permit if the state was negligent and not considering the rights of the river when issuing those permits and so forth. Okay, so getting to the focus. So then the court then chose another case, which was a case over alleged violations of the rights of the Akepi River, to establish sort of binding jurisprudence around this idea of the rights of rivers. And so they started by saying, okay, first we have to define what is the river's life cycle. And so talking to scientists, ecological scientists, as well as indigenous traditional ecological knowledge holders, they decided to define the river's life cycle through 3 dimensions. They said the structure, functions, and evolutionary processes. So by structure, they mean its morphology, like the shape of the riverbed, and the bottom and sediments, flow patterns, water quantity and quality. And the thing to keep in mind here is that these things then affect the functions, the natural functions that the system plays, which is, there's a variety of them. The court notes provision and purification of water, irrigation for food sovereignty, habitat for plant and animal life, food and drought control, but also like connectivity of ecological and social systems from the source all the way to the mouth, right, through the whole system. Again, like these systems are interconnected. That's really key here. And then when you're thinking about evolutionary processes, the court says you've got to view this historically. In other words, if you're trying to, because the importance of this here is a recognition that ecosystems are not static entities, right? They're dynamic, they change constantly. So when you're trying to think about whether particular alterations have gone too far, you've got to look at it historically and assess what's happening now against the historical pattern of the diversity and abundance of life forms that the system has supported. And so the idea is that drastic human interventions, if they're really indeed posing rights risks, violations, the risk of severe violations, that will be evident through this kind of historical comparison. Okay, so the court then also really dialed in on ecological flow as a really important metric. So ecological flow is the quantity and the quality of water, the magnitude, duration, timing, so forth, that's needed to maintain adequate system health and sustain a river's life cycle. And what's key here is that it's not, so the obvious examples would be where you're diverting so much water that the flow has diminished to such an extent that, the ecosystem collapses, right? It exceeds the tolerance levels. And I'm going to describe a couple of cases of that, but I think it's important to recognize that you can also undermine the life cycle of a watershed by increasing the flow, particularly if that water flow increase is accompanied by a lot of pollution, because that can, for example, change the turbidity and temperature, which can disrupt the reoxygenation of a river system and then therefore making it unsuitable for life, right? And there's another case of that as well that I'll show you. Another key principle that's come out of these various cases is that when you're measuring this, it's not enough to just take a moment in time and looking at point source pollution or flow. You've got to consider the cumulative impacts. So for example, if you're looking at the impacts of adding a new hydroelectric dam on the river, you don't just consider what the impact of that single hydroelectric dam. You take that into consideration along with the impacts of the other 3 or 4 hydroelectric dams that are also on the river, for example, right? And that you've got to, assessments have to be made in a way that reflects current conditions against a historical baseline. So there's too many, so in the Ecuador cases, I'm going to briefly summarize. There were violations that occurred because the state was taking records of flow that were years, if not decades old, and had not accounted for changes since that time due to things like logging, agricultural, and climate change, and that sort of thing. So I'm going to end here pretty soon, but I just want to go through a couple of case studies just to give you a sense of what this looks like in practice now, right? So the first and probably most important case was the case of the Ikepi River. And basically this was a case where the National Water Agency, which is called Sinagua, had authorized the diversion of 440 liters per second from this river to build an irrigation project for a community that didn't border the river, that was sort of inland for a while, right? And this is the kind of program that you would say a government should be engaging in, right? Because there's this community was experiencing drought, and this is a development project. But the riverbank communities, the communities living on the riverbank, filed suit alleging that this violated the rights of the river, and then therefore also their rights because they depended on the river, because it produced, already the river was having very low water levels even during rainy seasons. Ecuador has a rainy season and a dry season. So the Constitutional Court selected this case to make binding river rights jurisprudence. And in the end, what they decided or found was that the water agency violated the river's rights by exceeding the ecological flow thresholds during dry season. And the reason they did that was because they were using a faulty methodology for estimating flow. So they were making their decisions on these development projects assuming that there was a flow of 1,257 liters per second, but independent data showed that there was actually only 187 to just less than 300 liters per second. So there was not nearly enough flow to justify this. And this was a result of a failure to collect data across multiple years at the same seasonal point. In other words, they were using a faulty process for estimating flow. They were taking measurements at one moment in time, but sort of across different seasonals. So they're, anyway. And so that then resulted in an excessive diversion, which exceeded the river's tolerance levels, thereby threatening the life cycle. Therefore, they ruled that it was a violation of the river's rights, right? So the impact of that is that they said you've got to audit this irrigation project, and if you have to cancel it if you can't figure out a way to be able to do it without ensuring that the river's life cycle can be regenerated. And so they ordered a commission of comprehensive studies of the river's flow, and they ordered Sinagua to change the methodology it uses for measuring flow and on which it's basing its decisions. And there were a number of other things. Since my time is short, I just wanted to just give you one other case, because I think it's an interesting case, because it's an example of an urban environment, a river going through the heart of Quito, where the city was found to violate the rights of the river, not because it took too much water out, but because it essentially created an urban infrastructure that diverted a ton of additional water into the river system, essentially overwhelming it. So the municipality of Quito was channeling about 99% of the city's untreated wastewater just sort of directly into the river. So, but then on top of that, you've got urban rainwater runoff, which was loaded with hydrocarbons, and this dramatically increased the flow, which then caused intense erosion along the riverbanks, which changed its morphology in a way that increased the turbidity and temperature extremely, which then disrupted the river's natural reoxygenation capacity, which then in turn eradicated all the aquatic life and vegetation. And so this is a concrete example of what it means to say you're changing the river's flow in a way that's destroying its natural functions: water filtration, flood control, habitat protection. So the court ruled that this constituted a violation of the river's rights for that reason, and ordered the city to do a number of things. First, to start treating the wastewater, but then also create an infrastructure that's removing certain embankments, restoring wetlands, creating urban lagoons for filtration, and so forth. And then also installing permanent water quality monitoring to ensure that after the changes that are made are actually in line with the rights of the river to be able to regenerate its natural life cycles. The last thing I want to just point out is that then crucially, it also ordered the creation of a governance council made up of all the stakeholders who had interests in the watershed for the entire watershed basin, essentially, so that they could create a collaborative system for determining how to solve the problems of the stakeholder needs in a way that's consistent with the ability of the river to regenerate its natural life cycles and functions and evolutionary process, essentially. So I'm sure my time is up at this point, so I will stop it there. Thanks.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Craig. That was fantastic. I'm going to hand it off to Ernie Niemi. Get your slides.
Thank you. It's always a challenge to start talking about economics when other people are really talking about rivers and really wonderful things. But it's sort of necessary. I'm going to go very quickly because I found when talking to groups like this in the past when I went slowly so everybody could think about things that they tended instead to just nod off. So I also will say that in consequence, I will go fairly quickly. I think it's not overly fast, but if you have questions, I will say, and I mean it, ask me later. Michelle has how to contact me, and I do welcome helping you understand things. I really don't care whether I understand them or not. I've been doing this for a long time. I want to help other people. My title is Economic Importance of Protecting Nature, and I want you now to turn your brains off right there. I want you to get rid of the word economic. Because when you hear the word economic, when I hear the word economic, because of what we see in all of the advertising, whatever, that means money. Okay, it means how much you're paying for gasoline. It means what your income is. It means you're worrying about money, the economy. And so much of what we need to be talking about is not part of the economy. And that's why I'm here. So take economic off of that, talk about importance. As you take economic off of that, also take off the word value. Because you cannot think of the word value. Your brain cannot hear it without thinking, how much money is that? But we're really talking about things that are really very important. And many of them do not have money. I'm going to be talking specifically about the ballot measure that we have here, but appreciate that I will get there, and you ought to use this information to also think about what the hell's going on at the federal level, the importance of protecting nature at the federal level. You may have heard what that really means is drill, baby, drill. And also what it means at the state level here, where we have a governor who has committed her campaign, committed her legacy to being business friendly. What does that mean? It means this. It means allowing corporations, it means allowing billionaires to make money from nature. How do they do that? They kill nature. They convert nature to carcasses. They make money from selling the carcasses. We've seen this for hundreds of years. This is how capitalism got started. Well, we've just heard excellent presentation. I've never heard a presentation that good before on these topics. You pollute for profit. If you got something really nasty, let's see if we can just sort of pump it into the river and nobody notices, so that we make more money. And what we increasingly see, especially with fossil fuels, but also with the timber industry, also with industrial agriculture, also with industrial urbanization, is that people lie. So we have, and I'm not just making this up, this isn't just Ernie Niemi's opinion, there is research out there, a lot of it ongoing, on what is the disinformation campaign coming from the fossil fuel industry, how that links back to the disinformation campaign that was developed by the tobacco industry that allowed them to sell tobacco products and kill people for years and years and years. But now, thinking about importance, paying attention to nature and how the capitalist system works on that, what is our concern? Our concern is about the term ecosystem services. You use that term and most people, their eyeballs just roll back. They don't know what that means. They sort of understand what an ecosystem, how does an ecosystem service? What is that? What it really means is nature's contributions to human well-being. Didn't say economic contributions. Contributions to well-being. And here's how water does that. Here's how nature does that. It provides a large number of contributions to our well-being. Down here at the bottom is quality of life. Working up above that is provides us income, opportunities to have income, opportunities to have more income than we would have if we were being polluted. Jobs all the way up to cooling. An awful lot of these things do not have monetary measures. I want you to point out, I want you to understand that forest management, for example, so important here in Oregon, so important here in Lane County, forest managers did not use the term ecosystem services until the 1990s. Until then, forest management meant, how do you get more carcasses? How many trees do you kill, convert them to carcasses, to logs, and make money? That's all that it meant. So a lot of these are non-monetary, and yet I consider them to be the most important contributors or detriments to our quality of life, to our well-being. Now, some of these we actually can talk about money. We can, economists will work pretty hard on these things. So we know, for example, that FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, to the extent that it now exists or will exist in your lifetime anymore, they've estimated what are some of the values of the ecosystem services that we get from inland wetlands, $8,000 per acre per year. From green urban open space, you go downtown into Eugene, next to the river, that's a really wonderful place. That really contributes to our quality of life. It cools. You see an awful lot of people down there along the river on a really hot August day. It's a good place to go down, listen to the river, look at the river, see. You might see something really amazing in the river. So we can estimate some of these values. I want to point out, however, that these values and almost all of the monetary values you will see are based on an economic principle of how much are you willing to pay to get them. Come on. That's a scam. That's a scam that goes back to wealthy aristocrats in England in the 1700s. What we should be talking about is how much do they have to pay you to take this stuff away? And it's a much larger number than what we see here. You should never accept willingness to pay as an indicator of your understanding of the importance of these things. Notice I did not say value. So, how do we think about this? One way to think about this is that on the right-hand side, what do we talk about? We talk about the gross domestic product, which is the monetary value of human-produced goods and services. Work through that. Human-produced, doesn't account for whatever else, human-produced goods and services. Monetary value. On the other side, we have a concept that's equivalent. It's the importance of what the ecosystem gives us, the goods and services we get from the ecosystems. An awful lot of research has been looking at this. A couple of years ago, the UK Treasury Ministry, wasn't tree huggers, it was the Treasury Ministry, sponsored research to look at what is the value of these things compared to those things. Basically what they came up with is, if we look around the world at all of the research that's been done, if you have an ecosystem and you have industrial development, here's the return you get on your investment. But if you take that ecosystem and you invest in conservation and restoration, so you invest in conserving and restoring the ability of that ecosystem to provide you goods and services, it's at least 4 times larger. When you commit that ecosystem to industrial development, you are giving this up. We do not have governmental systems that can handle this here in Lane County. They can't. These folks don't have rights. That's why we're here. That's why I think we're here. This is what we give up if we have a governor who says, gee, let's sort of allow more deregulation of protecting our rivers so that I can be labeled as business friendly. This is what killing the EPA at the national level does to us. It's not, oh, the endangered species. It's not the species. You know, let's talk about importance to us, the harm to us. So, what do we know? We know that the Bureau of Land Management is saying that it is going to maximize logging on BLM lands in Oregon, going back to the 1960s. And many of you didn't live through that. Some of you maybe sat in trees to oppose that back then. It's ugly. But by accident, actually it was an accident because I helped manipulate this so that it occurred, the BLM hired some economists in 2013, 14, 15, and 16, and in 16 prepared their resource management program, and buried in that report, you have, here is the logging value, the value of the logs that we'll get, here's the cost of the carbon emissions that will accompany it for the proposed alternative, and then for alternatives with more logging, less logging. When you compare those, here's my translation of what that means. That means that at that time, 2016, a truckload of logs, the carcasses, the money value of the carcasses was about $1,000. The economist said, at the time we know that each ton of carbon dioxide going up into the air, and by the way, the timber industry is our largest generator of carbon dioxide in the air in the state of Oregon, by far. It's not cars, it's not trucks, it's not Northwest Natural Gas. I mean, I will throw stones at them to get them to move, but it's the timber industry. $5,000, because each ton was estimated to give $50 worth of damage. A couple of months ago, actually 1 month ago, new research published, looking only at the cost from heat. The cost from heat. None of these other things going on. The cost from heat was $1,200 per ton. So we're now looking at the carcass value has gone up about 3 times. That's gone up to $120,000. Research published about 2 weeks ago says that didn't count what's going on in the oceans. If you count what's going on in the oceans, you ought to at least double that. So part of my message to you is we have now gone from the 1600s when you could go out and convert nature to carcasses, and who cares? We're now in a situation where converting nature to carcasses is extremely harmful to you. Here's some indicators of that. Research done, published in 2014 in the National Climate Assessment. By the way, this has been killed by the current federal government. Estimated what are the summer flows and the extent to which it's going to be drought during the summer. Those flows are going to go way down. And that's, I think they probably chose a really ugly color to show that because it's really sort of ugly what's going to happen in this place where we like to think we have an awful lot of water and that our rivers are safe from whatever could come our way. Here's research that was done, published in 2015 by EPA, and it basically says if we did not have climate change, we would continue to have all of that blue, which is where the water in the streams is cold enough to support salmon. With climate change, it goes red. And it goes red in some places of Oregon where the Coast Range, yeah, it's going to go red in the Coast Range. It's going to go red wherever you think there might be cold water. Now that's from climate. Here's what happens when you log the land out there. The amount of water that comes off of the forest, and the forest, as we just had the explanation, is the forest really do help determine how much water comes off the land and when. But if you go out and clear cut, if they go out and clear cut, they take half of that away. So not only does that map showing all the red get red because of heat, it gets red because you've killed the forest to convert it to logs to sell the carcasses for cash. And here's what's really going on, the demand versus the supply of water. This is research that was 2024 from the Global Commission on the Economics of Water. This isn't Ernie Niemi made this up. The demand will outstrip the supply globally by 40% in the next couple of years. Half of the world's food supply is at risk. Now, yeah, there are great technologies. There's great research that said, let's increase food production and do all of that. I get it. But this is a tremendous risk. This is sort of the fundamental things that you just heard in the previous presentation. When you have food production going way, way down across the world, it increases scarcity. Now, does any of you at all have any insight? What happens when a critical resource becomes more scarce?
War.
Come on, people, gas prices. Give me a damn break. Okay? This is what we're talking about. If you're upset about what you pay for gas, if you're upset about what you pay for groceries, this says there's a lot more coming. Now, it may not be that agricultural production here in Lane County goes down, but it goes down someplace. Oil production goes down someplace. It affects the entire world. Our understanding of this, by the way, you ought to applaud the fact that we had a pandemic. Because until we had a pandemic, it was almost impossible to explain to an audience like you about global supply chains and how a flood in China or a pandemic in China could shut down our economic activity here. Well, some people really figure this out. And one of the reasons that they're figuring this out is because new research shows that warming has increased. In the last 10 years, we didn't know this. Last 10 years, warming for every increment of carbon dioxide added to the atmosphere just jumped up a lot. There's a fear that it's going to jump up even more than that. And when I talked about food production and shortages and all of that, some people are thinking about that, and the people who are really thinking about that is the military. Now, our military hasn't released any information. I don't expect that they will. I expect that they are even forbidden to even think about this because you can't use the word climate change at the federal level anymore. But the United Kingdom, MI5, MI6, those of you who pay attention to that know what that means. It's the intelligence agencies. They commissioned research. What's happening with ecosystems and what does that mean for our national security? It was almost verbatim. Every significant ecosystem around the globe is headed for collapse. Some of them, about a handful, they expect will collapse by 2030. Think about that. Some ecosystems are just going to collapse by 2030. And when they do, we really do have crop failure. We do have more natural disasters. We have food shortages. We have sectors of the economy collapse. And then they use a really interesting word, conflict. It means the UK is going to go out and try to grab the food that they need to support their people. And they're not going to be alone. Germany did similar analysis several years ago. So we know that militaries are paying attention to this. Meanwhile, back here, this is research that was published within the last month by researchers out of the University of Washington looking at America's rivers are alarmingly underprotected. What the color for the Pacific Northwest says it's about 20 to 30% are protected. If you want to do the arithmetic, that's 70 to 80% are not protected. So we have this specter of water shortages and all that comes from that in a reality in Oregon where our rivers are not protected against what's going to come. And so the researchers from the University of Washington, when they were interviewed, said there's an urgent need to secure rivers. That's why I'm here. That's why I think all of us are here. This is why. It's because this. Imagine that you are looking around the world for places where you can go to secure food for your nation. Well, gee, let's look at places that are known to have an awful lot of water. Wow! Look at this Willamette Valley in Oregon. And you know what? They've already using that water to grow grass seed. Why don't we use that water to grow food for our people? If you're not prepared for this, then I think you're not paying attention. Do I know how this is going to fall? No, I absolutely don't. I can't predict the future. I'm not that smart by any means. But what about jobs? Okay? We have a governor that's going to say exactly this. Got to have jobs. I don't know if you've seen this billboard. It used to be all around Lane County not too long ago. I expect we'll see it again, is that we'll have this wonderful, beautiful young person getting jobs to kill trees. The people who are working on this, to plant trees, manage the trees as they grow, and then to kill them, it's about 8,000 jobs in Oregon statewide. Just here in Lane County, we have 14,000 people working on outdoor recreation. And those people don't work in outdoor recreation if the rivers are dry, if the rivers are full of junk, if the rivers are going to kill your dog when you go down and let your dog swim in the river. Not only that, but the research goes around that when you have cities with clean water in the streams, like downtown Eugene, there are more jobs, especially small towns. And what you're going to hear for the BLM, for example, is we have to kill trees in order to have a healthy economy in rural Oregon. This is research published in 2021. People went around the world looking at different ecosystems. What's happened there? What happened to the economy when you either conserved it or you degraded it? And they said everywhere in the world right now, the ecosystems are so degraded. The supply of oil is so low that if you add a little bit of oil, it's really important. The quality of the ecosystems is so degraded that if you improve it a little bit, your return on that investment is very, very high. And so when you talk to people about what's going to be the impact of this ballot measure on jobs, say, yeah, it's going to cost us some money, but you know what? It's even more important for us to take care of the rivers. Thank you.
Thank you, Ernie. Michelle Holman. thank you both, Craig and Ernie. So here we are in Lane County. What are we going to do about it? That's what we're going to do about it. We're going to vote yes to protect our water. We wrote this law because we want better protection for the watersheds. We want to raise the standards for what does it mean to have a healthy watershed. The EPA says, well, you can have this much parts per million of this toxin over your lifetime. I don't remember being asked if I consented to that, but I don't really love that concept. Why do corporations have more rights and privilege and power to do harm in our communities than we have to protect ourselves from those harms? Well, you know, they're pretty savvy, and they work kind of underhandedly, and they have for decades, amassing more and more and more privilege and power, while you and I, we're the collateral damage. I live out in the Coast Range. I have seen it firsthand. I've been working on stopping the practice of aerial herbicide spraying since the 70s. They're still doing it. And when we engaged in that kind of activism where you write to your congresspeople, or you talk to the regulatory agencies, or you even go to corporate headquarters and try to talk to them or invite them to your community center, which we did, they always say the same thing. Well, it's legal. It's legal to spray poison from the sky. Just because it's legal doesn't mean it's right. It used to be legal to own slaves. It used to be legal to keep women away from the voting box. This is our time now. We are exposing and challenging what we see as an unjust law that allows degradation of our current health, well-being, and future generations into the future. We have a right and a responsibility to take care of the kids that we bear and the kids that they will bear, and so on and so forth. We have to do this now. It's been a crisis for some time. It's taken us a long-ass time to get this thing on the ballot, but it is on the ballot now, and we're going to vote yes. This is a principled fight. We're looking to grow the Army in the good fight. That's why y'all are here. We're going to have a field campaign. We're going to expect to see you folks in your neighborhoods talking this up. I just heard a stat, I don't remember the exact numbers, but 2 minutes of talking to a person face to face is worth all the expensive advertising that the opponents are going to bring our way. So this is grassroots. None of us are paid in our organization. We do this because we love the planet and each other. It's a mountain we're climbing, but we're climbing it 1 foot in front of the other. We're really proud of this one-page law that we wrote. We wrote it with the help of some really smart attorneys. It's not like we just were half-cocked and didn't know what we were doing. We actually know what we're doing. But I want to just read a little bit of this because I think of it as a love letter to the planet. And you know, here we are. It's our responsibility to do this work. So this is from the preamble of the Lane County Watersheds Bill of Rights. We, the residents of Lane County, understand that all water within the state from all sources of water supply belongs to the public, even where it flows over private land. And we believe access to clean water is a natural right of humans and all other species. In securing the health of watersheds of Lane County, we acknowledge that watersheds are living systems and possess the inherent right to exist, flourish, regenerate, and naturally evolve for their own sake, interdependent with and independent of human needs. Due to the ever-increasing contamination and demands of our watersheds, we, the citizens of Lane County, declare our responsibility as defenders of these ecosystems to ensure their highest legal protection from degradation, loss of ecological balance, and all threats to their health and well-being. Government has failed in its responsibility to the public by enacting laws that tolerate or permit the incremental degradation of watersheds and water quality. We assert that in order to protect our water and watersheds, we must shift governance away from policies that allow voluntary compliance or directly permit pollution by entities who view nature only as lifeless property and thereby merely regulate the degree of allowable harm to be inflicted on the watersheds. It has become necessary that we reclaim, reaffirm, and assert our inalienable rights and extend protections that provide legal standing and rights recognition to all watersheds in Lane County to ensure they are no longer subordinated as property subject to harmful actions by unaccountable political and corporate entities. Therefore, we, the citizens of Lane County, enact the Lane County Watersheds Bill of Rights, which establishes irrevocable rights for all our watersheds to exist, flourish, regenerate, and naturally evolve, free from contamination and degradation, and which thereby protects their integrity and natural diversity from now and into the future. What 2373 does is it recognizes the rights of our watersheds to exist, persist, and naturally evolve. It grants clean drinking water to all residents, and it does it by curtailing corporate privilege and power. So we join us. We love. Yeah, join us. We need you. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Ernie and Craig. Now we have time for questions. Yes.
Once we get this wonderful measure passed, how will we defend it against preemption?
Right. We will be working with our lawyers. If there is a challenge to it, we expect that the corporations will probably challenge it if it's passed, and that is part of the struggle is to defend it against state preemption. We here in our group know that the state preemption is really basically limiting our community's rights to our health and safety, and so that is the fight that's ahead. But part of what we're doing is trying to expose that the legal system, as it currently stands, does not allow communities to protect themselves. So that's part of the job. Yes, sir.
Question for Dr. Kauffman.
Sure.
Thank you so much. It was really cool to see. I actually worked with an organization, the Earth Law Center, that submitted a lot of amicus briefs for these cases and worked on the Alamy River case as well. So great throwback for me. Could you talk a little bit about the situation regarding standing and proving harm in Ecuador, or rights of nature generally speaking? We operate in an anthropocentric court system, and rights of nature is a biocentric way of looking at things. So how does standing work in these 14 cases that have been heard in Ecuador so far? Or what are some creative ways that we can potentially talk about standing?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the first thing I'll say, standing works. I'm sorry, what?
Can you repeat the question?
Oh yeah, so the question was basically, so in places where rights of nature is recognized legally, how is standing to represent nature in human decision-making institutions, how does that work? Is that the question? And so it's a complicated answer because different rights of nature laws in different countries structure this differently. So there is actually no one-size-fits-all. So I guess, did you want to know how it works in Ecuador? Or?
Yeah, either how it works in Ecuador
or just a couple of different examples?
Yeah, and any other creative strategies that we're sort of...
Yeah, so there's basically two, so the first thing I want to say is that legal standing is only one component of what the broad principles of rights of nature. So different societies that are operating in different legal and cultural environments are structuring and framing rights of nature differently for obvious reasons, right? And so one purpose of these rights of nature initiatives is to help societies switch their paradigm of how they think about humans' relationship to nature, to get past this idea of humans are separate and apart and nature is a bunch of these individual stocks that we can convert into, and rather recognize nature as systems. We're part of these systems, and therefore we have these interdependent reciprocal relationships. Therefore we should care, and this is not, You know, and so there are some initiatives that are they're really focused on that, you know, and the standing issue is sort of secondary because you're building in this logic up front into the decision-making process rather than sort of creating a law, waiting for violations to occur, and then going to the court to try to get them to like stop these other people, so there's kind of like these two different models. So in the second model where it's, you know, we're just gonna say this is what a violation is, and then we're gonna wait for a violation, and then we're gonna go to the court, and then you gotta figure out legal standing. And there's two basic ways this is, and in a general, there's two ways that this is structured. One is the Ecuador model, and this is the model that's generally here in the United States, which is you say, okay, we're gonna just sort of recognize this, either an entity or sort of nature in the abstract, understood as like these systems, as having these rights, and then we empower anyone to be able to represent nature. So representation is both voluntary, but it's not obligatory. And a lot of people think this is going to then just lead to a raft of lawsuits, but actually it tends not to, because it creates a collective action problem. You know, lawsuits are expensive, and if everybody can do it, but nobody is obliged to, then it tends not to happen unless you have a very wealthy benefactor who's just sort of interested in funding these lawsuits. So that's been true in Ecuador, and I suspect that's kind of how it works here in the United States as well. But so in other countries, they do it different, which is to say they will construct a new sort of governance institution, which is a collaborative governance arrangement comprised of all the stakeholders in a particular system, and then they are empowered, and they're not only empowered, they are obliged. They have a duty to, they must, to represent nature in various institutions. And that is, I'll just be honest, that's been a more effective way to go about doing it, in part because then you can embed these representative agencies in the various decision-making bodies so that the rights of nature is protected up front in the decision-making process rather than kind of waiting for a violation to occur and then going to the courts and then hoping someone will pay for a lawsuit.
And that's sort of the model in New Zealand, if I'm not
Yeah, so New Zealand is that, Colombia is another example, and there are, yeah, so.
Thank you, Craig. The gentleman back at the end of the program.
Ernie, I don't know if you're familiar with the... Thanks, Paul Richmond, a lawyer, journalist. Ernie, I don't know if you're familiar with a piece called The Coming Anarchy from Robert Kaplan, which came out in February '94 in The Atlantic first. But he basically
I was aware of it at the time, it's 1994.
He was predictive of, he basically was talking about the collapse of the ecology and said, we have two choices: build an economy that saves the ecology, or set up systems of control that maintain power relationships as it collapses. And so essentially, everything that we've since witnessed, militarization of police, the move of private security, mercenaries, homeland security, was actually predicted in that as a response to the environment. So just something to be aware of, and I applaud this.
Yeah, let me, there have been quite a few people who have thought about this, tried to work their minds around it, and give us warnings. And I'm not aware of any significant action within this culture where we paid attention to those warnings. To give you an example of where I think we are headed and we need to be very, very concerned, is that some of the billionaires apparently, again, I don't hang around in that crew, but apparently they are saying we don't need birds. We can make drones. We can make a drone that's prettier than any bird.
Oh, that's what you could drone.
We humans can replace anything in nature.
What
That's not a warning.
We're brain dead. The arrogance and such a thought. Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, so I helped a bit on an initiative up in Everett. It was the Ronnie Rights in Nature Initiative, right? Can you hear me? I'll try to do this. And they passed it in Everett for the Snohomish Watershed. Basically, they were doing water rights, right? And we were supposed to bring it to Olympia then after that as the next place to sort of do the Deschutes Watershed. And you know, they're stymied right now by a lawsuit. So I wondered if you were able to write this at all with any of the benefit of having you know, some of that happening before you, and what would have been different about some of the other rights initiatives, and how would you avoid some of that?
We definitely had the benefit of those that went before us. This is a process, continually learning, and we actually don't know what's going to happen with this one. Our comrades to the north of us in Lincoln County had a very successful campaign. They won. They were told that, you know, the sky would fall, the economy would drop, and there was no way that Lincoln County could do without aerial spraying pesticides, herbicides. It went directly to the courts, probably the day after you guys passed your law. You were sued, the county was sued. It languished for 2 years in the courts, all the way up to the Oregon Supreme Court. There was no spray that went on for those 2 years, and there was no economic collapse. So
2.5 years.
2.5 years, thank you. 2.5 years.
Is that because you got an injunction then that stopped the spraying?
It was a law that it was on the books that people
Yeah,
said,
okay.
we want this.
Yeah. So
Please
it's already-
enforce this. So it was enforced for 2.5 years, and then of course the Supreme Court, the Oregon Supreme Court had to side with the timber industry. No big surprise here. We all expect all this pushback. It's a process, so we learn every time we do this. We learn from other communities. This is a global movement of people defending right where we live. You know, they say all politics is local. Well, here we are, right here, where we live. We're going to do it here, and hopefully we will inspire those to do it there. And there'll be these little patchworks of protection. And one day there's going to be a blanket. It'll be a beautiful quilt. This is in my view of nirvana, which I will be, I'm sure, dead and gone. But I believe that exposing and challenging the fuckery is like, that's our job here. That's what we got to do.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
Sure, one quick caution and then a question. I just want to be careful that, you know, rights of nature, other environmental laws are not going to be weaponized to support xenophobia in the sense of they're coming, they're, you know, climate refugees, all that kind of thing, or like we've seen with CEQA, you know, urban sprawl that ultimately harms everyone. So that's the caution. And then the question is, can you speak to the difference between some of these more effective, possibly, hopefully, governing bodies that you're talking about for watersheds versus what we have now, like watershed councils here in Oregon?
Are you asking Craig or me?
Whoever wants to answer, but yeah.
I can share some thoughts. You know, so at one level, in just a procedural sense, I think these collaborative governance bodies that I would, like if you were to say, like appoint one and say you are the legal representative of this river, it doesn't have to look that different from a collaborative governance body of people who are sort of dedicated to protecting the river. The difference is in what are the principles on which decisions will be made and what is the goal. And so, you know, you can have a procedural body operate the same, but working based on different principles of decision-making and different goals. So I would say that's fundamentally the difference. So in some ways, the question, I think, is getting at what's the difference between rights of nature and just conservation. And so if that's the question, I would say the difference is based in the entire paradigm of the relationship between humans and nature. So the conservation approach, as I understand it, is based on this idea that humans are separate and apart from nature, and therefore, and we can manipulate nature, try to bend it to our will, and we should try to force nature to adapt to our needs and wants. And that then implies this idea, that has led to a practice of what we think of as conservation, which is nature's gonna be all that, separate from us, and we're gonna wall it off and try to keep people out of it or regulate how people interact with it and so forth and so on. And that's led to the critiques by many indigenous groups and other local communities who lived, harmoniously in relation to the local ecosystem, right? So it leads to rights violations, I guess, which is where I think you were going with this, with your initial warning. And so this is, I think, a fundamental difference with the rights of nature paradigm. It's just fundamentally different, right? It's based on the assumption that humans are part of nature. We're not separate. So there's an understanding that we are part of the system. We are living in the system. We are impacting the system. We're going to have an impact. This is not wall it off and don't touch. Like, this is, we're using it. But with that then goes a responsibility to govern ourselves as humans such that we behave in a way that allows the system to keep regenerating the conditions that are necessary to support life. So, and that's just a fundamentally different paradigm. And so the councils would ideally be pushing decision-making bodies to have, make decisions based on that sort of paradigm and certain principles around sustaining ecosystem functioning. So like when we're talking about sustainable development, I always tell my students when we're talking about sustainable development, you got to be real clear about what do you mean by development and what are you trying to sustain.
Yeah.
Right, because there are a lot of different models. And so here, with rights of nature, the idea of what you're trying, the idea of development is being able to have a high quality of life in a system that is balanced, meaning it's not going to exceed the tolerance levels and collapse. So the focus of that then is what you're trying to sustain is the system's ability to regenerate its life cycles. And everything else should flow from that. And that doesn't mean, and so human well-being should be understood as, that's necessary to ensure human well-being, because we're part of the system.
Yeah, for real. When the watersheds are healthy, all life is healthy. One point that people ask us all the time about, well, where do the watershed councils stand on what you're doing? And we knew that we wouldn't get endorsed by the watershed councils as councils. There are a lot of good people working in watershed councils who will vote yes. But we're not going to get the watershed councils to go with us because they operate on consensus. They always have the interest holders in the community on their boards, meaning Big Timber is on the board. They are not going to help us out here. So really the models that Craig points to would be made up of earth protectors, really. You have to be an earth protector. You cannot have profit motives be your guide.
Thanks, Michelle. And yes, your question.
I'm concerned about the image you had of the salmon fillet. Of the salmon fillet. And that is an image that has been used for decades for the tribal groups trying to save their rivers from the Columbia down to California. And you seem to view the salmon fillet as a carcass, as something negative, whereas this is a tribal right and a cultural right for these people for thousands of years. So I don't understand why, again, that salmon fillet is viewed negatively as opposed to all the fights that people all over have been trying to do to get healthier rivers so they can have a culturally relevant salmon fillet.
I think that's for you, Ernie.
indigenous communities, as I understand them from an economic perspective, are not in the same universe as billionaire corporations. What we're talking about, just heard, is humans are part of this system. So yes, if humans are part, in the same way that a wolf will go out and find food, then humans can go out and find food from the system. If you're in balance, that system will continue for a very long time. One of the amazing things is that we have had natural systems that have such capacity that we have been able to extract from them far beyond their ability to recover for such a long time. In economic terms, we have transitioned from systems of abundance, or taking a little bit out really doesn't disturb the system itself, to a system of scarcity, where we have taken far more than that system can recover. So, is a carcass on its own a bad thing? You know, go ask the wolf. Okay, I get it, I understand that. But are we consistent, as we as humans, in effect as a parasitical species acting on that system, are we taking too many carcasses for that system? Are we in effect allowing the system to recover, or are we passing that scarcity on to the next generation without regard, with total disregard? My understanding of the science research, and it's changing every week, the scientists are saying it's a lot worse than we thought it was last week. Temperatures are increasing, are accelerating. Here's a way to think about it. Okay, sort of the original economics of climate change. William Nordhaus got a Nobel Prize. Basically said, let's begin. Climate change goes up year by year, a little bit. Hot damn, because capitalism is perfect in that situation. Capitalism adjusts to market changes year by year. So what's going to happen is we will have extreme events. They're going to be small. We'll have a thunderstorm here, we'll have a hurricane or a wildfire. But it's going to be small, and then the system is going to respond to it so that by the end of the year it's done. It's over with. And then we don't have to worry. And so we could get up to maybe plus 5 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, and the impact on the economy will be maybe too small to measure. We're now at a system where 40%, what we have learned, again, because of the pandemic, thank goodness for the pandemic, because it told economists that we really are in a global system economically. It helped them understand that we are in a global system ecologically. Although we still have not figured out they have not figured out the oceans as far as I can tell. At all, not even close. In that sense, then, if you want to have drones instead of birds, if you want to have robots in the river instead of fish, then that's where we're headed. It really is your values. If that's okay with you, in fact, maybe that's ideal for you, then that's fine. But I think if you're supporting this measure, you're saying that's not acceptable. That you do, in fact, value nature and its ability to respond in the way it was just described.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one more question.
Thank you for the great presentation. I have two kind of logistical questions about the ballot measure. I'm just curious if there is a definition of watersheds within it that, extends all the way to the ocean and includes the estuary. I think that would be incredible. But also, I'm just curious, how the law would be upheld at the county level with respect to land use and comprehensive planning. Is that something you could do?
There is a definition. We have a section in the one-page elegant bill law that says watershed means the water and land area that drains rain, snow, and groundwater into a single outlet, such as rivers, creeks, lakes, wetlands, aquifers, and the Pacific Ocean. The watershed may be only a few acres, as in small ponds, or hundreds of square miles, as in rivers. And there are more definitions. So yes, we had some good, like I say, we had some good legal help. As far as how it will be enforced at the county level, the people speak. If it passes, it's a law. The county is entrusted to create policy around it. That's not really our job, that's the county's job. And then, of course, the courts interpret all day long new laws, and new laws come in. People have been saying to us, it's too broad, we don't have enough specifics. It's by design broad. We designed it broadly so that it could be subject to interpretation from now and into the future that we can't see. All rights-based laws are broad. Our own Bill of Rights is broad. The right to assemble, the right to free speech, very broad. So that notion that broad is not good is not good.
Can I say something? So, this is, so as Michelle said, this is typically the way it happens, which is to say, if legislation, this is sort of the equivalent of legislation at the local level, is always broad because it's focused on principles, because principles is the first step that you have to engage with when you're trying to create change. And so if you look at any legislation, even at the national level, if you read the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, they're very broad, very vague, very broad. And it is always then incumbent, this is the nature of the relationship between the branches of government, it's then incumbent on executive agencies to figure out a regulatory framework. So that, and then typically then you have secondary laws is what they're called, that then give the flesh to the bones of the general principles. So someone is going to have to do the hard work of trying to then craft a regulatory framework to implement this if it gets passed. And I would encourage everybody who cares about this to try to be involved in this process and not just be like, that's their problem, see what they do, because you likely are not going to like the outcome if it's just that's their problem, you have to figure it out. So at some point in the implementation, this is going to have to turn into more of a collaborative arrangement where we say, okay, presumably we all have goals of we want to have a healthy watershed ecosystem. If you're talking about UWeb, I think UWeb wants to, have healthy ecosystems, right, to do their mission. So you can appeal with that, and so then you can, let's figure out, we now have this mandate for sort of goals, underlying principles and goals. Let's now think about how we can think about measuring compliance and using, valid science to figure out thresholds and tolerance levels. And I think that's where it's got to go at the next stage if this thing passes.
Thank you. And then, questions about the actual measure. We have the measure. It's all on one sheet. We have plenty of copies of that at our table. To the question of how would this go forward, one section in the statements of law, for example, it says it requires the government to adopt protective and effective measures to prevent actual or remedy actual or potential violations of it. So that would be a requirement after the law is passed to adopt those changes. So before we all go, first I want to just thank you all for being here. I want to thank the panelists for a really engaging and thoughtful